Backpacking is a good way to broaden your horizons by visiting towns or countries that you've never been to. It also affords you the opportunity to experience unfamiliar cultures and traditions on a much tighter budget than is normally the case. However, it can also be incredibly dangerous, as many people have mysteriously disappeared while backpacking, and many of these people who have gone missing have never been found. In 1989, Charles Horvath, a 20-year-old man from Yorkshire, England, was visiting his father and grandfather in Ontario before setting off on a backpacking trip across Canada where he was born. On the 3rd of May, he arrived in British Columbia, where he stayed at a hostel and occasionally with friends, as well as the Tiny Tent Town campsite. He would be turning 21 in August and had arranged to meet up with his mother, Denise, and his stepfather in Hong Kong to celebrate the occasion with his mother's 40th birthday. On the 11th of May, he sent a fax to his parents to coordinate the travel plans for the trip. But before they could make any further arrangements, he mysteriously disappeared. Denise contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and begged them to look for Charles. But when she got very little help, she decided to fly to Canada and look for herself. She posted flyers all over town and was eventually contacted by a woman named Joanne Zabroff, who had befriended him. Denise learned from Joanne that Charles had been staying at a campground in a rough part of town, and she traveled there to find out if anyone had seen him. The manager of the campground told her that Charles had left abruptly, leaving behind his tent and all of his possessions. One night, when Denise returned to her hotel, she found a note from an unknown person who claimed that Charles had gotten into an altercation on the 26th of May and lost his life in the fight, and had been left in a lake near a bridge. Local divers volunteered to search the lake, but came up empty-handed. Not too long after, a man named Gino Borden came forward and told police that he had seen Charles during an all-night party that was held at the campground. When he woke up the next morning, he realized that Charles had left without taking anything with him. When police contacted Charles' family in eastern Canada, they were told that during his stay with them, he said that he intended to disappear off the face of the earth and that his mother would never find him again. Despite hundreds of reports from people who claimed to have seen Charles over the years, he still remains a missing person 32 years later. Aubrey Sacco was reported as a missing person on the 24th of April, 2010, when she mysteriously disappeared in the Langtang region of Nepal where she had been backpacking. A trekking guide reported that he had met her at a nearby tea house the previous day, and after spending the night together, Aubrey had gone on her way. She then traveled to Sherpa Lodge in an area known as Lama Hotel, where she stayed to have something to eat. While there, she met 3 men, and witnesses reported that they were talking amicably at first, but at some point an argument broke out when they insisted that her next destination was too far for her to hike to. She disagreed and took out her map, pointing to an area called Riverside, and stating that it was only an hour away and that the men were lying to her. She then left the lodge and continued on alone. Riverside was, in fact, 2 hours away, but Aubrey never arrived and she's never been seen or heard from since. Her father, Paul, flew to Nepal to search for her, and between the 4th of May and the 1st of June, he was joined by more than 200 people who searched the area by foot and air, but to no avail. The Langtang Trail, both sides of a nearby river, and all the trails in between were also thoroughly searched, but no trace of her was found. On the 31st of July, 3 men were arrested after Aubrey's clothing and some of her possessions were found in their homes, but they were released soon after with no further evidence coming to light. Some people believe that she may have been attacked by 1 or more locals, or that she may have fallen into the river after losing her way. Aubrey remains a missing person, however, and her mysterious disappearance remains a mystery. A French backpacker and cyclist named Arthur Angy became a missing person on the 28th of January, 2017. 3 years earlier, he had set out from France on a backpacking tour that would see him cross the world by bicycle and on foot. He was last seen in southern Bangladesh, where it was reported that he'd hoped to cross the border into Myanmar, where he would travel to Malaysia to meet up with a friend. He had attempted to find a boat that would take him from Chittagong to Malaysia, but he was unsuccessful and decided instead to travel through Myanmar. An official missing persons report was filed by his family on the 21st of March, and his story gained a lot of attention in the French media. But his case soon grew cold when no leads were forthcoming. On the 24th of April, his sister, Maeva, reached out to his entire mailing list, requesting anyone with information to come forward. But this also didn't yield any results. Arthur's mother held multiple interviews with French media outlets, and even gained the attention of France's First Lady, Brigitte Macron. His family also traveled to Bangladesh on several occasions to search for him. But with travel being difficult and often restricted in the country, they were unsuccessful. On the 15th of June, his family stated that he was seen by police at the southern border with Ukiah and Myanmar, but he was refused permission to cross. They claimed to have put him on a bus to Cox's Bazar city, 18 miles away. In February of 2019, Arthur's backpack, credit cards, and ID were found in a thicket at the border between Bangladesh and Burma. His passport and iPad were, however, never found. Some people have speculated that he may have been arrested while trying to cross the border, where the Myanmar military was busy with clearance operations, located just over the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. Others have speculated that he might have attempted to cross the border via India, which has a border crossing Tamil. Arthur's friends and family contacted border authorities but didn't manage to obtain any information, and he remains a missing person. Alex Humphrey, a 29-year-old child support worker from Manchester, England, mysteriously disappeared in Panama on the 14th of August, 2012. Earlier in the month, Alex had decided to go on an independent backpacking trip and was due to fly back to England on the 28th, but he was last seen on the 14th. After checking in to Hostel Varen in Bouquet, he had planned to travel to a waterfall to do some sightseeing, and he was seen by the owner of the hostel as he was leaving the following day. 2 days later, he had not returned to the hostel, and she became concerned that something may have happened to him. She went to his room and found that he had left most of his possessions behind. She then decided to contact his family and informed them that he was missing. Panama's search and rescue team searched for him with the help of helicopters and 40 searchers, but they were unable to locate him or any clues that could lead to his whereabouts. Alex's brothers, Martin and Andrew, flew out to Panama and met with the country's Minister of Tourism and officials from Britain's Foreign Office. They took part in national media appeals and began distributing flyers to bus and taxi drivers in the area where he was last seen. They received a report that a disoriented Alex was spotted at a bus stop in the small town of Las Lajas, 70 miles away. But upon investigation, the man could not be located, and it was never verified to be Alex. After a week of searching, the team scaled back their efforts, and Alex's mother flew out to aid in the search. The family decided to hire an American private investigator living in Panama, but once more, they were unable to find any leads. The family then appealed to Greater Manchester Police to aid in the investigation, but officers were obstructed by Panama authorities, who stated that they didn't believe a crime had been committed in Alex's case, and that it was just a missing persons report. The family now has no choice but to rely on quarterly reports from checks made by the Foreign Office in Panama, but to date, there have been no further developments and Alex's case remains unsolved. In March of 2007, Nicole Vino, a 32-year-old woman from Canada, was on a solo backpacking trip in Syria. She was in the final month of her 6-month trip and had already traveled through West Africa and other parts of the Middle East. She intended to only stop in Syria for a brief time, as she was making her way to Turkey. On the 31st of March, she asked a desk clerk at the hotel that she was staying at for directions to a popular sightseeing spot known as the Beehive Houses, as well as a castle that is located close by. After getting directions, she left the hotel and mysteriously disappeared. Her mother became concerned when she didn't reply to emails wishing her a happy Easter, as it was out of character for her to be out of touch with her family for weeks at a time. On the 19th of April, her family contacted the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and learned that Nicole had never made it to Turkey. They contacted the hotel where she had been staying, and they were casually informed that she never returned and that her belongings were still with the hotel. This included her journals, clothing, and memory cards that she used with her camera. When they learned that she intended to travel to the Beehive Houses and the nearby castle, guest logbooks were checked, but there were no entries made by Nicole. Locals who were questioned also didn't remember seeing her, as she would have stood out, being a Western woman and not having her hair covered. On the 29th of April, Royal Canadian Mounted Police reported to her family that Nicole's bank accounts and credit cards had not been accessed and that her traveler's checks had all been cashed in March. In August of that year, her family was devastated when they received an email from 2 Syrian men who demanded ransom money for Nicole's release. They were eventually tracked down and arrested in Spain, but it would come to light that they had no information on her whereabouts and had only sent the email in a bid to extort money from her family. The men had gotten information about reward money being offered by her family from flyers that had been distributed in Syria. The 2 men were charged with extortion and given prison sentences. Despite a $45,000 reward and heartfelt pleas from the media to anyone with information to come forward, Nicole was never found and remains missing to this day. One of the most notorious disappearances in the history of the United States took place in 1991 and remains a mystery to this day. At the time, 21-year-old Angela Hammond from Clinton, Missouri, worked as a bank clerk while attending classes at Central Missouri State University. In January of that year, she had become engaged to Rob Schaefer, an athlete who had aspirations of joining the military. On the 4th of April, after attending a barbecue, Angela dropped Rob off at his house where he would be babysitting his brother. The couple had arranged to meet up later after Rob's mother got home from work, but in the meantime, Angela spent time with her friend Kyla. At 11:15 p.m., she called Rob from a payphone located 7 blocks from his house. During the call, she noticed a man in a green Ford pickup truck circling the block several times. Eventually, he pulled up next to Angela and used one of the other payphones before getting back in his vehicle and using a flashlight to search for something in the truck. After describing the man to Rob, she asked if he needed to use the phone, but he replied that he would try to use the other one again. After a few moments, Rob heard Angela scream and heard the man say, "I didn't need to use the phone anyway." Rob immediately jumped in his car and drove to the payphone, and on his way there, passed the man's truck, which was traveling in the opposite direction. He heard Angela scream for help from inside and immediately put his car in reverse, damaging the transmission. He managed to follow the truck for 2 miles before the car's transmission gave out, and no one ever saw Angela again. Rob was cleared of any wrongdoing, and despite hundreds of alleged sightings of Angela across the US, and every possible lead being followed up on, her creepy disappearance remains unsolved. Former Major League Baseball player Byron Mofin is the subject of a true crime mystery and mysterious disappearance that remains to be solved. In 1974, McLaughlin was signed by Montreal as an amateur free agent. He played as a position player for the West Palm Beach Expos until the following year when he moved to Baltimore, playing in the Appalachian League for the Bluefield Orioles. In later years, he would move back and forth between the major and minor leagues until October of 1984, when a warrant was issued for his arrest after he failed to appear in court on previous charges. In 1990, he was arrested when he was found to be involved in illegal trafficking of counterfeit Converse, Adidas, and Vans shoes, as well as money laundering. It was also discovered that McLaughlin had a secret bank account in Luxembourg containing a total of $2.4 million. He pleaded guilty to the charges of money laundering, but before he could be sentenced, he fled the country and remains a missing person today. For years, it was believed that he might be living in France, but this was never proven, and he still remains a fugitive. It's common to hear about abduction cases on a near daily basis, but very rarely does a case emerge where someone was kidnapped twice in their life. This was the case with Teddy Wang, a Chinese businessman who founded the China Chem Group that went on to become one of the country's largest and most profitable companies in the pharmaceutical sector. Teddy's fortune stemmed from the paint and chemical business owned by his father. After marrying his childhood friend known as Nina, his family moved to Hong Kong and the business eventually transformed into China Chem Group. On the 12th of April, 1983, Teddy and Nina were traveling in their Mercedes-Benz when they were hijacked and abducted. Their captors kept Teddy chained to a bed for 8 days, during which time they demanded a ransom payment of 33 million Hong Kong dollars. Nina was released in order to secure the funds, and she paid the ransom, resulting in Teddy being set free. But on the 10th of April, 1990, he was abducted once again as he was leaving the Jockey Club in Hong Kong, and this time his abductors demanded a ransom of 60 million. Nina could only procure a down payment of 34 million, which she then paid to the kidnappers, but Teddy wasn't released. Soon after, several of the abductors were identified and arrested, and when they were questioned about the crime, they shared shocking details of what had allegedly happened to Teddy. They told police that Teddy, who was then 56 years old, had been taken out into the ocean on the 13th of April of that year. They claimed that he was thrown overboard, never to be seen again. No trace of Teddy was ever found, and he was declared deceased in 1999. Following his mysterious disappearance, Nina ran China Chem Group, eventually making her the richest woman in all of Asia. But soon, a legal battle ensued between Nina and Teddy's father, who claimed that a document, which was prepared in 1968, was discovered in a family safe deposit box that named him as the sole executor of Teddy's estate. Nina, however, produced a sealed envelope that was given to her by Teddy a month before his disappearance. In it was a document witnessed by one of their servants, in which he leaves his entire estate to her, making her 5 times richer than Queen Elizabeth II at the time. Teddy's sister testified that she had seen Nina practicing writing in her husband's handwriting, claiming that she had forged the documents and the signatures it contained. It was also pointed out that Teddy was in the habit of signing documents in English, whereas Nina's were in Chinese. Nina was ultimately found to have forged the documents, and in 2005, she was charged with the crime but released on bail. China Chem Group was handed back to Teddy's father, but 9 months later, the decision was overturned, and Nina gained control once more until her passing in 2007. Nina's personal assistant claimed that Nina had received phone calls from Teddy up to the year 2000, but this was never proven, and his fate remains an unsolved mystery. John Paul Sr. is best known for being an American racing driver who won both the 24 hours at Daytona and 12 hours of Sebring races. His career started when he became a club-level road racing driver in the 1960s, during which time he won the Sports Car Club of America Northeast Regional Championship. His wife left him in 1972, taking their son with her, and John spent the next while living on a sailboat before returning to racing 3 years later. This time with his son, who was working as a part-time member of his crew. In 1979, he won a total of 6 races, eventually securing the Trans Am title. He and his son would become the first ever father-son team to win the IMSA Camel GT race, a feat that they managed to complete on John's wedding day. On the 10th of January, 1979, Paul Jr. and Christopher Schill were apprehended by customs officials while loading equipment onto a pickup truck near a canal in Louisiana. They were questioned when one of the officials smelled an illegal substance on their clothing, leading to Paul Sr. being arrested on his 42-foot boat when illegal substance residue and $10,000 were found on board. Nearby, a rented truck was found, which contained over 1,500 pounds of the substance. All 3 of the men pleaded guilty to possession charges, and they received 3 years of probation and were ordered to pay $32,500. On the 19th of April, 1983, a man named Stephen Carson testified against Paul Sr., claiming that he'd been approached by Paul, who ordered him to get into the trunk of his car. When he refused and fled, he claims Paul used a weapon to fire at him, but fled when he realized that Carson wasn't alone. Paul was arrested, but after being granted bail, he decided to flee. He was eventually arrested again in Sweden after he used a fake passport, served 6 months, and was extradited back to the US. He would ultimately be found guilty in the Carson case and sentenced to 25 years behind bars. He was eventually paroled in 1999, after which he met a woman named Colleen Wood. The couple decided to undertake a 5-year around-the-world trip on his 55-foot schooner. The following year, Colleen mysteriously disappeared, and John was questioned, but no charges were filed against him. Soon after, John also disappeared, though he was spotted in the Fiji Islands and later again in Thailand. The FBI continues to search for him, as they need to question him about Colleen's disappearance, but he remains a missing person and his whereabouts are unknown. The true crime story of Victor Guerena's disappearance started on the 12th of September, 1983. During this time, Victor was a well-liked and trusted employee at the West Hartford offices of the Wells Fargo Express Company in Connecticut. On that day, Victor arrived at work as per usual and approached his supervisor to ask if he could park a car, a full-sized 1973 Buick LeSabre, inside the building as it belonged to his friend, and he didn't want it to be damaged or broken into. The supervisor was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed, and Victor left the car there before continuing on his rounds, collecting cash from banks and businesses in the area. By 9 p.m., they had collected more than $3 million to be deposited into the Wells Fargo vaults, which already contained over $4 million. By this time, Victor, his partner, and the supervisor were the only employees left in the armored car terminal, and he asked his partner to hand over his weapon so that he could check it in for him. He then walked to his supervisor's office, held the 2 men up, handcuffed them, tied their feet together, and covered their heads with jackets to keep them from seeing what he was up to. Over the next hour and a half, he proceeded to offload $7 million from the armored car and vault into the Buick before opening the bay door and fleeing in the car. His fellow employees eventually managed to free themselves and contacted the police. After searching for 18 hours, police found the vehicle abandoned 8 miles away, but Victor, his accomplice, and the money were nowhere to be found. It was later discovered that Victor was part of a group who moved him and the money to Mexico. Shortly after, he was sent to Cuba and the money was relocated to Puerto Rico. Victor was added to the FBI's most wanted list from 1984 to 2016, but he has never been caught and his whereabouts remain an unsolved mystery. In 2014, Prabdeep Strawn from Canada was studying law at the Bond University in Australia when he became a missing person. During this time, he decided to embark on a 1,000-mile trek across the country, planning to end his trip in Melbourne. Strawn, who was a Canadian military reservist, decided to rent a van for the trip and travel to Charlotte Pass in New South Wales, but made the mistake of not informing any of his friends or family what his plans were and when they could expect him to return. The first signs that something was wrong came when the rental van wasn't returned to the hiring company on time. The van would be located in Charlotte Pass on the 13th of May, and because of his military background, his family was hopeful that he would be able to survive in the wilderness, despite plummeting temperatures in the mountains. A 38-square-mile area was searched by police to no avail. On the 22nd of May, the National Parks and Wildlife Services crew was performing maintenance on the Opera House hut on Lady Northcote Creek when they heard the faint sound of a human voice on several occasions. The crew was aware of the missing hiker, and so decided to perform a search of the area, despite it having been already searched. A helicopter was scrambled to the area and was directed by the crew, but despite using infrared equipment, Strawn was still nowhere to be found. Police stated that no activity had taken place on his cell phone since the 24th of May, and his bank accounts have also not been accessed since. They also had no reason to believe that Strawn had disappeared intentionally, or that foul play was involved. The search was scaled back on the 1st of June, leading his family to spend more than $100,000 on private search efforts. But despite many more searches being carried out, he has never been found, and his mysterious disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. Cian McLaughlin from Ireland was last seen on the 8th of June 2021 in Jackson, Wyoming after setting out on a hike. Cian had been working as a snowboard instructor and bartender at a ski resort, and according to his friends and family, he was in his element and enjoying spending time in America. He was first reported missing by his mother, who traveled to the area to assist in the search for her son. On the day of his disappearance, he was spotted by a climbing guide at around 3:45 on the Lupine Meadows Trail, where his car was also found. Cian was an experienced outdoorsman, but at the time, conditions on the trails had become hazardous due to the melting snow and ice. More than 45 search missions involving helicopter search teams were launched in an effort to locate him. But despite thermal imaging equipment being used, they were still unable to find him. Added to this were efforts made by search and rescue dog teams that navigated steep and treacherous areas of the mountains, but they too were unsuccessful. Park staff also traveled to the Phelps Lake area, as it was one of Cian's favorite places to visit, but he wasn't located there either. Soon after, search efforts were focused on the Delta Lake area, as it was a difficult area to navigate due to large boulders and rough terrain. But once again, they had no luck finding him. Cian's uncle, Colm O'Higgins, has asked for anyone who was in the area at the time to closely study any photos or videos that were taken, as they may contain vital clues on his whereabouts, or of the conditions at the time that he went missing. Cian is described as wearing a red Apple Watch, a white t-shirt, a pair of shorts, wire-rimmed sunglasses, and a unique silver necklace when he was last seen. He had not been carrying a backpack at the time and was traveling light. Anyone with information is urged to call or text 888-653-0009. On the 2nd of June, 1974, Wynant Moore was looking to get away from his everyday life in Lexington, Kentucky, and he decided to go on a weekend trip to the Natural Bridge State Park, where he could enjoy some time off. His fiancée, Ruth, drove him to the Mill Creek Lake area, where Wynant said he was going to do some camping, fishing, and hiking. They arranged for Ruth to return to the same spot on the 2nd of June, where she would pick him up. But when she arrived as scheduled, Wynant was nowhere to be found, and she reported him as a missing person to park officials and the local police. As soon as his disappearance became local knowledge, 2 fishermen came forward and reported that they had found a billfold, clothing, shoes, and a wrist brace around the Mill Creek area. The items were found to belong to Wynant, but 2 blankets and a black zippered bag that he had taken with him were still missing. A large search was undertaken by search dog teams, Park Service employees, law enforcement, and several local agencies who scoured the area, as well as Mill Creek for clues. But despite their best efforts, no trace of Wynant was found. Few other details are available in this missing persons case, other than him being described as 5'11", weighing between 150 to 190 pounds. He has brown hair and blue eyes, with an athletic build and freckles on his face. He would currently be 76 years old, and anyone with information on the case is asked to contact the Kentucky State Police at 606-784-4127. 54-year-old Ronald Baldwin from Buckner Hill North Road in Bonneville, Kentucky, was last seen on Saturday, the 12th of June 2004, on his 300-acre farm. He has remained a missing person ever since, and his mysterious disappearance has baffled investigators as well. On that day, Ronald set out to go four-wheeling on his farm, along with the 12-year-old son of a neighbor. At some point during the ride, the boy's ATV was running low on fuel, and he returned to the house to get more. But when he attempted to return to Ronald, he couldn't find the area where he had last left him, and eventually left. It was common for Ronald to spend hours out in the forest, so at first his family wasn't concerned for his safety. But when he had not returned home by 9:30 the next day, they became worried, and his girlfriend reported him as a missing person. The sheriff's office, along with the emergency management staff and a rescue squad, started an immediate search for him, but were forced to take a break at around 1 a.m. on Monday morning. They resumed the search that afternoon and continued well into the night, but came up empty-handed. Another search effort was made on Tuesday, again to no avail. But searchers were determined to scour all of the 300-acre property, much of which was on rugged terrain filled with underbrush, thorn bushes, and caves. Ronald's ATV was eventually found by one of his neighbors, along with his prescription sunglasses, his shoes, and an unfinished bottle of early times whiskey, which has been described as being unusual as he wouldn't normally leave his alcohol lying around. No signs of a struggle or foul play were found, but there also wasn't any sign of Ronald. Investigators found it highly unusual that despite the involvement of several agencies, many hours of searching, and the fact that Ronald was on his own property, they had been unsuccessful in their efforts to find him. Ronald is described by his family as being 5'7" to 5'9", between 230 and 235 pounds in weight, with white shoulder-length hair and a beard. He has brown eyes and a scar on his left wrist. He also has a tattoo of a woman on his back, a flag on his left hand, and a sword on his right hand. At the time of his disappearance, he was wearing a straw hat with a flag pin, blue bib overalls with glasses, and tennis shoes. Anyone with information about Ronald's possible whereabouts is urged to call KSP at 782-2010 or the Hart County Sheriff's Department at 270-524-2341. Amy Beckle met her husband Steve while she was studying at the University of Wyoming. During this time, she was a competitive long-distance runner who was hoping to qualify for the 2000 Summer Olympics. On the 24th of July, 1997, Amy told Steve that she was heading out to do a few errands in town after teaching a children's weightlifting class at the Wind River Fitness Center in her hometown of Lander, Wyoming. After finishing the class, she stopped in at Camera Connection at around 2:30 p.m., after which she went to Gallery 331, where the owner, Greg Wagner, states that he spoke to her. He noted that she seemed to be in a rush as she kept glancing at her watch while they were talking. That was the last time she was ever seen, and she remains a missing person to this day. Authorities believe that after leaving the gallery, Amy drove to Shoshone National Forest to practice for a 10-mile run that she'd been scheduled to compete in. An eyewitness later told police that they saw a woman resembling Amy running along the road wearing black shorts that were similar to the ones she had been wearing at the time of her disappearance. Steve, who had been spending time with a friend, returned home at 4:30 p.m. and noticed that Amy wasn't home yet. At 10:30, when she had still not returned, he contacted police and reported her as missing. On the 25th of July, Amy's car, a white Toyota Tercel, was found on a turnout at Burnt Gulch in Lander at approximately 1 a.m. By 3 a.m., Steve had traveled to the area along with friends and family to aid in the search for her. But they were unsuccessful, and by the 27th, police were being inundated with calls and leads that numbered up to 1,000 per day, but none of them yielded any positive results. Various mines and lakes were also searched, but to no avail. At first, investigators believed that Amy had either been attacked by a bear or a mountain lion, or that she had succumbed to the elements. But when a series of journals were found to describe violent acts towards women, including Amy, her husband became a suspect. He was interrogated by detectives on the 1st of August, claiming that they had evidence against him, but he quickly ended the interview, later stating that the entries in his journal were lyrics that he had written for his band, and had nothing to do with Amy or her mysterious disappearance. His alibi was confirmed by friends who told police that they'd been rock climbing with Steve on that day, though he refused to take a polygraph test. In June of 2003, a Timex Ironman watch similar to Amy's was found near a river, but it could not be proven that it was hers, and her disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. A $10,000 reward has been offered in the FBI case of Pedro Santamaria that occurred on the 21st of March 2015. On that day, a shipment of gold was being transferred from South Florida to Massachusetts after being refined by Republic Metals. While the gold was being transported, Santamaria and two accomplices, Adalberto Perez and Roberto Cabrera, caused the cab of the transport truck to fill with pepper spray, forcing it to stop. The men then tied up the two Transvalue employees who were transporting the gold, loaded 10 gold bars into their vehicle, and fled the scene. 9 of the gold bars were then melted down in order to make jewelry. Perez and Cabrera were eventually caught and given lengthy prison sentences, but the majority of the cash value of the gold was never found. Santamaria was identified as the remaining suspect after one of his accomplices and Miguel Bover, who tried to sell one of the bars in Miami, named him as their fellow robber. They also told investigators that they managed to track the transport vehicle by placing a GPS device under the tractor trailer. They placed pepper spray canisters inside of the truck for remote activation, and once the truck had stopped, they approached it while identifying themselves as police officers. The men were then tied up and led into a nearby wooded area, but were left unharmed. The jeweler, who melted down and sold 9 of the gold bars, told the FBI that he made around $1.2 million from the deal, and he was given a probationary sentence. When Perez and Cabrera were arrested in 2016, they had a total of $600,000 in cash in their possession, but the gold was already long gone. Cabrera was given a sentence of just under 11 years in prison, and Perez was sentenced to 11 years behind bars. Santamaria remains a fugitive, however, and the FBI has asked anyone with information on his whereabouts to contact the nearest FBI office, American Embassy, or consulate. The unsolved FBI case involving John Anthony Quinn started in April of 1988 when he worked as the general manager of Federal Protection Services, a company that provided banks and various other financial institutions with security guards and security. On the 9th of April of that year, Quinn arrived at work where a supervisor named Harry Goldberg saw him on several occasions, sitting at his desk, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But unbeknownst to Goldberg and his fellow employees, Quinn had been spending the morning loading cash from a vault into boxes. He then loaded more than $1 million into the trunk of his company vehicle and put another $107,000 into the trunk of his car. He asked Goldberg to follow him to his house, where he dropped his car off and then returned to the office with Goldberg. Once there, he got into his company car and drove to Palm Beach International Airport after allegedly placing $1.3 million of the cash into suitcases. Once at the airport, he unloaded the money and disappeared, despite not boarding a flight, renting a car, or taking a cab. Quinn's wife contacted police when he didn't return home that night, and she found the $107,000 in his car's trunk. They also found a note from Quinn that read, quote, "I've done something very wrong and I can't stay and face the consequences." To make matters worse, the money that was stolen has no pre-recorded serial numbers and no bait bills, meaning that Quinn can never be tracked via the money. It was also discovered that he'd previously been suspected of a $70,000 theft at a firm where he worked before being employed by the Federal Protection Services. Furthermore, it's believed that he fled with a girlfriend, as he'd been leaving his house at 5 a.m. every morning, but only arrived at work at 9:30. Investigators assume that he spent his time before work at a girlfriend's house, and that they fled to either Hawaii or Baltimore. They've also stated that he may be living under the name of Calvin Kluge. Anyone who has any information on Quinn's case is asked to contact the FBI at their nearest office. Quantavius Murphy, a 21-year-old man, was added to the FBI's most wanted list for his involvement in the robbery of an armored Garda truck in North Charleston in South Carolina. On the 16th of January 2021, Murphy, who is also known as Popeye, and his accomplices James Edward Sewell, Anthony T. Drill Burge, Thomas Schooner Calhoun, and Terry T.T. Pollard, traveled to an ATM at 5900 Core Road. Sewell was the driver of the armored truck, and when he arrived at the ATM, the four men pretended to accost and rob him, and Calhoun struck him with the firearm to make the scene look more believable. They then proceeded to take $1.9 million in cash, which they loaded into a Chevrolet Malibu before fleeing the area. At first, Sewell denied having anything to do with the heist, but when he was confronted by investigators who found inconsistencies in his story, he admitted to being the inside man. He told FBI agents that the remaining robbers planned to meet up in their hometown of Cedartown, where they would divide their loot. Murphy was then spotted with his mother 2 days later in Cedartown, and she told agents that he had recently bought a Chevrolet Monte Carlo and had given her a grocery bag filled with money before giving a shoebox filled with cash to another relative. $130,000 of the money was eventually recovered after searches of Murphy's family's properties were conducted, and Burge was taken into custody at a gas station in Cedartown. When his house was searched, agents found money bands identical to those found in Murphy's family's possessions. Calhoun was eventually arrested in Georgia on the 23rd of March, and Pollard was arrested just 6 days later. It's believed that the men may have been members or associates of the Folk Nation gang. For now, however, Murphy remains at large, and investigators believe he may be in the Atlanta area and should be considered armed and dangerous. A $10,000 reward has been offered to anyone with information that leads to Murphy's arrest. If you have any information on the case or know where Murphy may be hiding out, you're urged to contact the FBI Columbia office at 803-551-4200. If you'd like to submit a tip online, you can do so at tips.fbi.gov. The FBI is searching for 43-year-old Jose Ramirez, who was involved in the kidnapping of a 69-year-old man in New Mexico on the 26th of July, 2018. On that morning, the victim had just walked out of his house and climbed into his red 2004 Ford pickup truck when he was approached by Ramirez and a fellow accomplice. The two men were wearing hats and blue bandanas over their faces. One of the men grabbed the victim by the back of his neck and placed his hand over his mouth to stop him from calling for help. The victim attempted to fight his attacker off, but the second man then joined the fray and hit him several times in the face with a firearm. During the scuffle, one of the kidnappers dropped his firearm, and the victim managed to grab it off the ground. He attempted to use the weapon, but it malfunctioned. When he noticed that the other man was also armed, he stopped fighting back as he was afraid that they might end his life. The kidnappers then forced the man into the middle seat of his own pickup truck. A shirt was placed over his head, and he was driven away with his attacker's weapons pointed at him. The man told police that as they drove away, his attackers called him by his first name and said that they knew of 2 of his safes that he owned as well as money that he had in the bank. They demanded that he give them $50,000, but he was able to convince them that he could only get access to $10,000 of it. After driving a few miles, the kidnappers bound his hands and feet and put him in the bed of the truck. He was then taken to a shed in a remote area where he was left still tied up on a couch. When the men returned, they ordered him to phone his daughter with instructions to wire the ransom to a bank in Guadalajara, Mexico. But for the wire to go through successfully, she had to make several calls to the bank, and she recorded the conversations, later handing it over to the FBI. The victim was released at around 10:45 on the 26th of July, and he helped investigators locate the site where he was held, but his attackers were no longer there. The FBI has warned that Ramirez should be considered armed and dangerous, and he should not be confronted by members of the public. A $1,000 reward has been offered to anyone with information on this case. You can contact the FBI's Albuquerque office at 505-889-1300. The true crime story of this unsolved case involving Timothy Thomas Coombs started back in 1985 when Robert Juice, a self-proclaimed minister of the Freeman movement, which doesn't acknowledge the US legal system, was convicted after he drafted a fake court order for one of his followers, who was arrested for a minor traffic violation. Juice contested his conviction for the following 9 years while hiding out on his farm in rural Missouri. But in June of 1994, the Highway Patrol was ordered by the prosecuting authority to take him into custody. They waited for Juice to leave his farm, and he was arrested on a country road alone. He was taken to the McDonald County Jail by Sergeant Steve Dorsey and Corporal Bob Harper. But as he awaited his trial, one of his followers decided to enact revenge on his behalf. On the 16th of September, Harper was at his home celebrating his 33rd wedding anniversary when someone fired at him through his kitchen window. He was struck by the shot but would go on to make a full recovery. The following day, investigators found a shell casing 245 feet from the house in a clump of trees. They immediately connected the incident to Juice's arrest, and when they traveled to his farm to speak to his girlfriend, they were confronted by a man named James Wilson, with whom they spoke for about a half hour. One of the strangest cases of a missing person who has never been found is that of Kenneth Playstead. Playstead disappeared in 1971, leaving behind a wife, 6 children, and a secret he hadn't wanted any of them to know. Before his disappearance, Playstead had been a respected attorney in Wisconsin. He was the county family court commissioner and found himself handling trust funds of some wealthy clients. To the outside world, he had his life together, though one of his sons mentioned he had trouble with the business associate. On November 16, 1971, he and his wife traveled to Milwaukee, where his daughter was studying. She wanted to buy a car and he was going to help her with that. He also had a business meeting to attend. He left his wife to go shopping at a department store, then went to the business meeting at noon as scheduled. The plan had been to meet with his daughter at 1 p.m., then go to pick up his wife, but Kenneth never made it to his daughter. At about 1 p.m., his daughter looked out the window to find her father's car parked on the street outside. She thought he would come to the door and got ready to leave, but nobody came. She assumed he must have made a mistake and the car belonged to somebody else. Hours passed and Kenneth still hadn't arrived, so she went to inspect the car. It was then that she realized something strange had happened. The car parked outside was her father's, but he was nowhere to be seen. The keys were missing and the car was unlocked. It looked like someone had rifled through the glove box, but gifts he had bought were still in the back seat, untouched. Kenneth's hat was found in the gutter nearby. It had been trampled. Kenneth was reported as a missing person and the investigation began, but the case quickly took a turn. It was discovered that Kenneth had been taking money from the trust funds he handled and putting it into his own bank account. Somewhere between $65,000 and $178,000 was missing. At first, it was thought that he simply ran with that money, but investigators found that it had already been spent, and Kenneth had simply stolen the money to cover his own spending before he vanished. The missing person case was handed to the FBI, who thought Kenneth had disappeared to escape justice. His family thought differently, though. They couldn't imagine Kenneth leaving them all behind, and suspected something more disturbing had happened to him. No trace of Kenneth was ever found. The theory that he ran to escape justice is still one that's the strongest, but a judge ruled that it was unlikely he was still alive, as he would have contacted his family if he was. The case remains unsolved, and given the time that has passed, it's likely to remain that way. When Diane Suzuki disappeared, it seemed as if she had vanished into thin air. In the space of just 15 minutes, she was gone, and her case remains unsolved to this day. Diane was a well-liked young woman living in Hawaii. She was 19 years old, a student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and worked as a dance instructor in 1985. It was July 6, 1985 when she disappeared. She was teaching a class for children at the Rosalie Woodson Dance Academy. It was scheduled to finish at 3 p.m., and she had plans to meet friends outside 15 minutes later. The class took place like normal, and nobody there suspected anything was wrong. Her friends arrived on time outside, but Diane didn't come out of the dance studio. They went inside and discovered Diane was missing. Her friends immediately figured something was wrong and contacted police. Police didn't take this strange missing person case seriously at first, though. Diane was a popular young woman, and they thought she had gone off with some other friends and would be back soon. They did a small search of some parts of the dance studio, but not the entire building, and interviewed some of the staff there. It led them no closer to finding Diane. When it became clear there was more to this disappearance than Diane simply changing plans, a proper search of the dance studio took place. The women's bathroom in particular warranted more investigation. The door looked like it had been forced open, and there was a small amount of red splatter on the floor, but it was too little for police to determine if something violent had happened. They also wanted to speak to another member of staff, a man named Dewey Hamansaki. He was a photographer who worked at the studio. When he had been interviewed, he had a wounded hand, and he said that it had been an accident with a pair of scissors. Police now suspected it was something more, and he would later fail 2 lie detector tests, but police had no real evidence that he had actually been involved. Years later, police managed to get a warrant to search Hamasaki's home. They found no trace of Diane, but Hamasaki had some warning that the search was going to take place. They believed it was possible if Diane's body had been buried in his home, it had been removed a few months earlier. The case officially remains unsolved, and Diane's whereabouts are unknown. Henry Borinsky was a beloved Roman Catholic priest living in Yorkshire when he vanished without a trace on July 13, 1953. The circumstances surrounding this strange missing person case have left investigators baffled, but there are plenty of theories. Borinsky was a Polish priest who had come to England during the Second World War. He had served with the Polish Second Corps and was later a teacher at a grammar school before being appointed chaplain to the Polish community in Bradford. He replaced the previous chaplain, a man named Bolesław Martinellis, who hadn't been well liked within the community and had allegedly been having an affair with a young woman. Martinellis refused to leave Bradford, though, and continued to serve a small Lithuanian community. Borinsky had only been part of the community for about a year before his mysterious disappearance, but he became an important part of the community in that time. He was well loved by most, and his vanishing had a huge impact on Poles in Bradford for generations. It was a warm summer evening when the mysterious case began. Earlier in the day, Borinsky had received a phone call from someone who spoke with a Polish accent, saying Martin Ellis had asked him to visit. Borinsky obliged, but when he went to his predecessor's home, Martin Ellis said he had given no such message. Later that evening, Borinsky received another call. The housekeeper, a woman named Irene, had gone to answer the phone only to find Borinsky was already talking into the receiver. He spoke quietly and had his hand cupped over the receiver. Irene described the one-sided conversation as odd. Borinsky spoke in short, clipped Polish, which was very strange to him. The mysterious conversation ended with the phrase, "Okay, I'll go." He left the house in a heavy overcoat. Borinsky was last seen leaving the street where he lived. Who was on the phone and where he was heading are just some of the mysteries that have never been solved. Many suspected Soviet spies were responsible for the disappearance. Borinsky had been an outspoken anti-communist. In particular, it was believed that there were Soviet agents in England trying to force refugees from Eastern European countries back to their countries of origin. Borinsky stood against this, which was another reason why he was so loved by his congregation. Not long after Borinsky disappeared, Martin Ellis was found in his home, collapsed. Written in matchsticks in Polish beside him was the phrase, "Stay silent, priest." Some have suggested Martin Ellis was used to try to get rid of Borinsky. Martin Ellis denied this and would pass away due to a heart attack in 1955. In 1962, a Soviet spy confessed to have taken Borinsky's life in an act of mistaken identity. Realizing this wasn't the man he had been sent to deal with, the assassin had buried the body. A search of the moors turned up nothing, and the confession was dismissed. Over the years, more wild theories have come up, including a conspiracy involving the church, but no evidence for any of these have been found. It seems as if he really did walk into thin air that summer evening, leaving behind an unsolved mystery. Jean Saint-Pierre was an 18-year-old woman who disappeared while walking along Highway 16 in British Columbia, where she lived with her parents. No trace of her has ever been found, and what happened to the young woman remains a mystery. Virginia was described by her family as a shy young woman who didn't like to take part in any high-risk activities. She had dark hair and eyes. She had a job at a canning factory, where she had worked with her boyfriend up until early October of 1971, when he disappeared. She was the second youngest of 6 children born to First Nations parents. Her parents were relatively strict, according to her siblings, and instilled a good work ethic in their children. It was October 14, 1971, when Virginia disappeared. That evening, she had been at home with her sister-in-law, her brother Rod's wife, Violet, when her mother returned home. Virginia and her mother went into the kitchen, leaving Violet outside. After a short while, Virginia came back out and looked like she had been crying. Violet tried to find out what was wrong, but Virginia ignored her and left the house. Her mother told Violet she would be back soon. At some point after that, Virginia met up with her cousin, a young man named Alvin. They walked along Highway 16 towards the railway overpass just outside of town. It was a cold evening, and both Virginia and Alvin had left their jackets at home. Alvin decided to go back to his house to get a jacket and his bike. His house wasn't far away, so it wouldn't take very long. Virginia continued to walk. Alvin thought she was heading towards a store just outside of town, and it wasn't long before Alvin was on his way back. When he wasn't far from where he had left Virginia, he heard a car door slam shut. By the time he got there, there was no car to be seen, and Virginia was missing. When Virginia didn't return home, her mother tried to file a missing persons report. It was a few days before the RCMP picked up the case and a search of the area where Virginia was last seen began. No trace of Virginia was ever found. Her boyfriend was a different matter, though. His body was discovered in a river a few days later. He had drowned, and it didn't seem like foul play was involved. It seemed unlikely Virginia would run away. She was planning on moving in with Rod and Violet, so even if she had an argument with her mother, it would have made more sense for her to just go there rather than disappear entirely. Years later, Highway 16, where Virginia disappeared, would become known as the Highway of Tears. A number of First Nations women have lost their lives along a stretch of that highway. Her disappearance came almost exactly a year after the disappearance of another young woman who vanished from Highway 16. Virginia's siblings still hope to someday find answers to this mysterious missing person case, and have worked hard to keep the RCMP case open. It's likely someone knows what happened to her, but for now the case remains unsolved. August 12, 1989 should have been a day of making happy memories for 19-year-old Kimberly McAndrew and her family. Instead, it was the beginning of an unsolved mystery that remains unexplained to this day. Kimberly was planning to go to a local music festival that evening with her boyfriend, sister, and her sister's boyfriend. She was excited, and her boss at Canadian Tire in Halifax allowed her to finish her shift early. She left the store where she worked as a cashier at 4:20 p.m. This was the last confirmed sighting of her. Kimberly lived with her sister at the time. When she didn't return home that afternoon, her sister called family and friends to see if any of them knew what had happened to her. They realized nobody had seen her since she left work, and they were dealing with the missing person case. The mystery was reported to police, who began work straight away, but there was little evidence to go on. Nobody in the area surrounding the tire store had seen Kimberly. When the case got more publicity, some unconfirmed sightings were reported. One was of Kimberly taking a bus to nearby Dartmouth. Another was an employee at a flower store in Dartmouth who said Kimberly had come in that afternoon and bought a rose and a balloon. One of the investigators who worked the case after Kimberly disappeared has dismissed these sightings. According to him, Kimberly was not an adventurous individual, and going to Dartmouth would have been an adventure for her, even though it wasn't too far away. The case has been looked at multiple times over the years, but no new evidence has come to light. Police believe foul play was involved, and a number of serial offenders have been suggested as possibly responsible for Kimberly's disappearance. Multiple searches have taken place, but so far, she still hasn't been found. The mysterious disappearance of Donnie Martin III occurred on the 3rd of August, 2017, and he has not been seen or heard from since. At the time of his disappearance, Donnie was working at a tree trimming company in Madison Heights, Michigan. At around 11:30 a.m. on that day, he received his paycheck and he left his place of work near 10 Mile Road on foot. Shortly after leaving, he was spotted by his brother-in-law, who offered to give him a ride home, but he declined the offer, saying that he would prefer to walk instead. About 20 minutes after leaving work, he exchanged text messages with his girlfriend, making her the last person to speak to him. When she tried contacting him again later, she got no reply, and his family reported that they were also unable to get a hold of him. He was reported as missing the following day at around 11 p.m. Police attempted to trace Donnie through his cell phone signal, but this proved fruitless. The area between 7 Mile and 8 Mile roads was searched all the way to Woodward Avenue, and photos of Donnie were given to police officers in Detroit and surrounding areas, but this also failed to provide them with any leads in this mysterious case. Donnie's family and investigators put up missing person flyers in Detroit and Madison Heights in hopes that someone had seen him, but no one came forward. Investigators noted that Donnie often visited the areas of John R. Street and State Fair Avenue, and they believe he may have been in that area prior to his disappearance, but this has not been proven. Currently, it isn't known if Donnie left of his own free will, or if he was the victim of foul play. He's described as around 6 feet tall with brown hair and blue eyes. He weighs approximately 230 pounds and was last seen wearing a red shirt with his workplace ABK Tree Services logo printed on it. He was also wearing blue jeans and tennis shoes. If you or someone you know has any information on Donnie's case, we ask you to contact Sergeant Hatunian of the Madison Heights Police Department at 248-585-2100 or Crime Stoppers at 1-800-773-2587. A $2,500 reward is being offered for any information leading to the person responsible for this disappearance. When Sarah McMahon became a missing person on the 8th of November 2000, her case quickly went cold. But when the Western Australia state government announced it was increasing the rewards in 11 missing person cases and homicide cases to $250,000, one of which is Sarah's, it returned to the public spotlight. Shortly before she mysteriously disappeared, Sarah had started working at an irrigation company in Claremont, Perth. As she was leaving after her shift at around 5:15 that day, she told some of her colleagues that she had somewhere to be by 5:30, and she was never seen again. Her car, a Ford Meteor sedan, was discovered in the Swan District Hospital's parking lot 12 days after she vanished, and her cell phone was found on the Great Northern Highway on a median strip. Her bank accounts have also not been accessed since her disappearance. During the investigation, it was found that she received 4 calls to her cell phone on that day, one from a friend, one from her sister, and 2 more from a man called Donald Victor Morey. Morey has been interviewed by investigators on several occasions, but he denies any knowledge of her whereabouts. During an inquest, however, he stated that Sarah was indeed alive and claimed that she had 2 children. He later recanted his statements, saying that he was talking mumbo-jumbo. Morey was later found guilty of attacking a street worker and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. On the 11th of November 2011, Natasha Tracy Ann Kendrick testified that she saw Morey carrying something that was wrapped in a quilt over his left shoulder, and that she was certain it was Sarah's body, but no evidence of this has ever been found. At the inquest, which was held in 2012, it was ruled that Sarah was a victim of homicide, though no further suspects have been named. Anyone with information on Sarah's case is urged to contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Wojciech Fudali was born in Poland, but he grew up in Massachusetts. He spoke English, Polish, Spanish, and German, and held a degree in international business, and he seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, until he became a missing person in 2008. On the 5th of December of that year, Wojciech had attended a small party at a friend's house located in the 70 block of East Shore Road in Rhode Island, and he stayed over for the night. At around 5 a.m., his friends were awoken by loud noises in the house, and when they investigated, they found Wojciech undressed and hitting himself in the head with a metal pole from his bed frame, while repeating the words, "Trust me." They decided not to call for help and went back to bed. Sometime between 5 and 11:30, he left the house without his money, keys, phone, or clothing. His friends woke up at around noon and assumed that he had gone for a walk, but when he hadn't returned by 1 p.m., they filed a missing person report. While investigators were interviewing his friends at the house, another of his friends arrived and reported that he had seen Wojciech at around 11:30. He was running near Galilee Escape Road without any clothes on. Some of his clothes were found in another house, leading police to believe that he had undressed soon after leaving his friend's house. Witnesses came forward to report that they had seen a man in a hooded sweatshirt sitting on a dock behind houses located on East Shore Road that same day. Another witness added that they had seen a man that looked like Wojciech jogging in the nearby marsh, again with no clothes on. Officials and state police members searched a bird sanctuary and the area of Galilee Road for 4 days, but with no result, despite having help from canine units and helicopters. Police also noted that the temperatures dropped to 30 degrees at the time of his mysterious disappearance, and stated that he would not have survived long without his clothing. Foul play is not suspected in this case, but Wojciech remains missing to this day. A $4,000 reward has been offered to anyone with helpful information in this case. He is described as 6 feet tall with brown hair and blue eyes. He weighs around 200 pounds and has a tattoo of a black eagle under his left rib cage. Anyone with information is asked to contact police at 401-789-8967 or the Rhode Island Cold Case Unit at 877-743-6583. While moving back to her family in Arkansas in 2004, 30-year-old April Pitzer mysteriously disappeared, and she has not been found to this day. On the 27th of June, 2004, April visited an elderly woman in Newberry Springs, California, who she had been taking care of, to say her farewells before permanently moving back to Arkansas. The following day, she packed up all of her belongings and got ready to board a bus to Arkansas. A friend of April's, a man named Chuck Hollister, dropped her off at a bus station in the 30,000 block of Caspian Way, from where she planned to catch a bus. But April never arrived at her destination, and on the 16th of July, she was reported missing. Then, on the 9th of September, a message was discovered written on a tile in a rest stop bathroom on Interstate 5 in Oregon, which read, "Want to find missing girl from Arkansas? 115 freeway, 3 miles east of Barstow." This led police to believe that April had been abducted, a theory that was further strengthened by the fact that she had earlier testified as a federal witness against 32 people who were part of an illegal substance ring in Arkansas. She had left for Newberry Springs when her identity was compromised. The area around the rest stop was searched, but nothing further was found, and the author of the message was never identified. On the 9th of September 2009, police were contacted by a Barstow bus driver who had some information on the case. He stated that he had overheard a female passenger say that she heard rumors at a party that April's life had been ended, after which her body was moved to an abandoned mine shaft in the desert. When the Red Dog Mine in California was searched, a white suitcase, items of clothing, and a mattress stained with biological material were found. But all forensic evidence had been rendered useless due to the high temperatures in the area. April remains a missing person, and foul play is strongly suspected in her disappearance. The San Bernardino Sheriff's Department has asked anyone with information on April's disappearance to contact them at 760-256-4838 or 909-387-3690. Patty Vaughn, a 32-year-old woman from La Vernia, Texas, is yet to be found after she left her home on Christmas Day in 1996, following an argument with her estranged husband, JR. The previous day, Patty had attended a family Christmas gathering, along with her children and new boyfriend, known only as Gary, who she introduced to her family for the first time. The following day, her husband was scheduled to spend some time with their children. She then planned to drop them off at her cousin's house, while she and Gary went out on a date. But that morning, she got into an argument with JR over her new relationship. Her sister, who was living in Georgia, spoke to her on the phone later that day and stated that she sounded distraught. Family members traveled to Patty's house to visit, but they were told by JR that she was in her room and feeling ill. He then dropped their children off at her sister's house for the night. He later told police that they'd had an argument that evening, resulting in Patty storming out of the house at around 6:30 p.m., taking her keys and purse with her. He stated that she left in her minivan and never returned. When Patty's cousin couldn't contact her that evening, she filed a missing persons report with the local county sheriff's office. That same day, her Dodge Caravan was found on the side of Texas State Highway, Loop 1604. Inside, police found traces of biological material on the back seat and the sliding door. The driver's side front tire had seemingly been deflated intentionally, and the vehicle's carpet had been washed. A red jumpsuit containing an emblem with the letters JM was also located in the car, but her purse and keys were missing. Inside her house, investigators found more biological material in her bedroom, the master bedroom, and a mop. The samples from both sites were found to belong to Patty. JR denied any involvement and refused to cooperate with investigators. Patty remains missing. She has blonde, light brown hair with green eyes and weighs around 130 pounds and stands around 5 feet 7 inches tall. Anyone with information can contact the Sheriff's Office at 210-335-6000 or 210-335-8477. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.